Here is how top CMOs evaluate which kinds of businesses to start and which ones to disregard. So in this video today, I'm going to be breaking down several pieces of criteria that I look at when deciding which types of businesses I want to go into. So if you're not familiar with me, my name's Damon. I'm a fractional CMO. I manage several different marketing teams, and I've been able to see over the years a lot of insights into like which types of businesses do well and which ones don't. I've probably started, or at least attempted to start probably about 10 different businesses over the course of my life. Of those 10 or so, one did about $400,000 per year. Another one scaled to as much as about $10 million a year. And the other 8 basically failed. Um, in addition to that, a lot of my friends are founders, run their own companies. Most people I talk to on a daily basis are as well. I've consulted with hundreds of different companies over the last several years that have scaled to 7-figure run rates. And probably most importantly, in my last company that I was previously at, Offer Launch, we actually launched 14 different companies in 1 year. Essentially what our company was doing sales and marketing from end to end for businesses, where we came in and basically just ran client acquisition. So that was a lot of just experience jammed into 1 year. And that really helped me to see, at a bird's eye level, what's going to do well, what's not going to do well, what's going to be a waste of time, money, and energy versus what is going to be a slam dunk. So make sure you stay till the end of this video. I'm going to be breaking down every single piece of main criteria that I look at when going into a business. This has saved me tons of time, honestly, in hindsight, just knowing and having a strong gut feeling on what's going to do well and what isn't. And if you just pay attention to these and execute on this yourself, hopefully this can save you millions of dollars, if not years of time in your life. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So first and foremost, what's the top thing that I look at? It is how big is the problem and how painful is it? If we look at just marketing fundamentals, people are either seeking pleasure or moving away from pain. I love pain-based companies. How can we hone in on a pain that someone is facing and just fix it for them, and ideally take a percentage in order to do so? To give you an example, this past year, my biggest pain point, like hands down my biggest pain point inside our companies, was sales team show rate. We spent, about $330,000 to about $400,000 per month on ads over the course of this year. On average, our show rates were hovering between 20 to 30%. That effectively means we are wasting 70 to 80% of our ad spend on we're basically just lighting it on fire. We're basically just lighting like $250,000 on fire every single month. That equates to, I suck at math, what is that, like $3 million a year or so, just lit right on fire. If you came to me and had like a bulletproof way to say, hey, Damon, I will fix your show rates, I'll get them to 100%. And you told me it was $500,000. And I knew I had reasonable proof, I had reasonable, reasons to believe that this was actually going to work, I would cut you that check in a heartbeat, and I'd be happy to pay that, because the problem's so big, it's so painful, the amount that we were losing out on because of this, not only from a financial standpoint, but there's other factors in there. Recruiting, for example, keeping top sales talent, that's a big one. The general just time wasted, the amount of time that could have been put elsewhere, wasted, huge. That's kind of how I look at things first and foremost. How big is this problem we're targeting? How painful is it? How can we insert ourselves into there and find a way to take a percentage? That is hands down the biggest thing that I look for. If you look at the biggest companies in the world, look at Amazon, for example. I don't really go to Walmart. I don't go to Target. I don't really shop in person these days. If I want to buy something, I just go on Amazon. It saves me so much time. And for a lot of people, that is the case too. This is having to go to the store and buy like toothpaste or something. The amount of time wasted at a macro level across America. Most people brush their teeth in America. You've got like 350 million people or whatever. That's a big problem. Not necessarily the most painful problem, I'd say, but it is a big problem that they're helping solve. So and just getting things quicker. But that's where I'd start, is there. And second, timing. Timing is huge. So, one thing I have noticed, especially in online businesses where a lot of times the product is nothing too crazy, it's something that can be like spun up pretty quickly. Look at like e-commerce brands, for example. People will see a product that's trending in e-commerce and then they just take it to market really fast. And then 3 weeks later, once you see the ads everywhere, then people hop on the trend and kind of steal it. Timing is very, very important when it comes to business. For example, one of the businesses I'm pretty interested in is the email newsletter business model. Like back in 2015 or so, 2017, I believe, that kind of general time frame. Companies like the Morning Brew or the Hustle, they just kind of came in and just dominated it. It was a total blue ocean. You look at how young people get their news. Young people, your average like urban millennial living in New York is not reading or not watching like Fox News or CNN. But what they do is they check their inbox every single day, because if you're like a corporate professional or something, you live in that inbox. You are checking it 24/7. So these companies really exploited that model. And they were early, they were very early to market on it. And because of that, the Morning Brew sold for $75 million. I think the Hustle sold for like 25 mil, somewhere in that range. And it's really just a big email list that tells the news. It's nothing like mind-blowing. But that happens across the board. If you can take a business and front run something that's going on, it's like companies that started building in AI back in like 2015 to 2020. They really front run, what we're seeing right now with LLMs. Companies that were building in crypto early on that were able to get to a good place before crypto really became mass market, like exchanges, for example, like a Coinbase. Being just early to something that's going to be huge, I think is super, super key. Like right now, I think a couple things that are kind of flying under the radar are things like robotics or virtual reality. Everyone's talking about AI in 2025. Everyone's talking about the crypto bull market, especially after this past weekend. Not many people are talking about robotics or drones or the intersection of AI and robotics. So things like that, if you can be early, if you can build early before something becomes really, really popular and really widespread, and you can be like a category king and ride a macro level wave, that's huge. It's very, very big. Okay, next, team structure. So none of this shit matters if you don't have the right team in place. If you can't execute, it doesn't matter how, big of a problem you're solving, or if you time it perfectly. If your team sucks, your team sucks. It's that simple. Like it's, most people don't succeed in business. Most people kind of, can't make a company work, and that's just the brutal reality. It's very cutthroat in a lot of ways. So I look a lot at the team. For me, I've been running businesses for 7 years or so now, and I look at it like this. I always come in as a CMO. I'm not a CEO. I'm not a founder. I'm not a driver personality. I'm a behind the scenes operator. I'm the type of guy that can be inserted into the right situation, put in charge of marketing, have a little bit of overlap on sales too, and just scale things to the roof. That's what I did in my last company. That's what I'm going to do in all future companies. But in order for that to work, I think you need a couple kind of key personalities. You need, first and foremost, a good founder, good CEO. A lot of times those are two different people, by the way, but a good founder who just takes a ton of action, who is very risk on, who's willing to put capital into things, who really kind of forces people along to like move super fast. I think that is super valuable. Someone who just has a high pain tolerance, is willing to like push through a wall for 3 to 6 months until things finally work. That's big. I think you need a good operator, someone who is able to take that founder personality who wants to do literally everything. They have a thousand fucking crazy ideas every single day. The operator needs to be someone who is able to kind of rein them in a little bit and focus. You need someone who can just help say like, hey, that is stupid. That's not smart. We don't need to do that. you're going to have 100 different ideas. Let's just like take 3 of them and let's actually execute on them. Let's actually do them. Let's put the KPIs behind them. Let's put the action steps into Asana. Let's hold the people accountable to actually getting it done. Because especially founder type personalities, they want to do everything, but they aren't necessarily the best at like follow through a lot of times. That's why you need almost, I would say, like a good COO personality, a good operator who is going to help with that. That's super key. And then lastly, you need a good acquisition mind. You need someone who understands growth. CMO can fit into that role. A good director of sales can fit into that role. Sometimes those are the same person. Sometimes they're 2 different people. But you need to insert someone into the business that knows how to make money. Like I'm not a driver personality. I'm not necessarily like a operator in the sense of like helping to focus. I have a mix of kind of both those categories. But what I am good at is just driving revenue. Put me into any company in the world, I will find a way to drive an egregious amount of revenue as long as I have a credit card and a decent amount of ad spend to work with. I'll help to build the sales team. I'll help to build all the paid marketing. I'll help to grow the organic channels, get eyeballs onto us, get calls booked onto the sales team calendar, all of that shit. You need someone who is going to make money and think about making money. Because if your company doesn't make money, despite what, VCs say and whatnot, I don't really think it's a company. Until you're generating revenue, you just kind of have a hobby on your hands. And you need to have the right team structure in place in order to make that work. Okay, next, financials. So this is a very key one. Okay, when I am analyzing financials, now I'm no CFO, but I think there's a couple different things that go into place here. So also take this with a grain of salt. I'm not talking about like venture-backed startups. I'm not talking about local businesses or anything of that sort. I'm mainly talking about online businesses here because that's what I do. We're talking about bootstrapped businesses where the founder is basically bankrolling the whole thing themselves. So that's how I look at this. Now, that is a totally different world. I'm not a VC. I don't know too much about raising capital, but the way those companies operate is fundamentally very different than, how I've run my businesses where I'm bootstrapping the entire thing, where I'm putting my own capital into this and working on those timelines, those limitations. So first thing I'm looking at is, how long is it going to take this thing to get off the ground? Like for me, I don't love working in businesses that are going to take a really, really long time to make money. If you're looking at like one company I was involved in this year, it was about 18 months in on product development, over 150 grand in dev costs. And that's just, if you're bootstrapping, it's tough. I want to come in and be able to start getting results, start driving revenue ASAP. Because like if you're putting tons and tons of money into product, you're going to need a decent amount of cash. So I look at how long is it going to take to launch. That's one of the first things I'm thinking about. Next is timeline to cash flow. So on that similar note, once you launch, when do we start making money? It's that simple. Like when is cash coming in the door? And also burn rate. In order to start generating cash, how much do we got to spend? I look at things on the marketing side in terms of CAC to LTV. So what does it cost me to acquire a new customer, and what is the long lifetime value of the customer? I look at, ideally minimum 3-to-1 ratio. So like if I pay $1,000 to acquire a customer, I want to make sure the LTV is at an absolute bare minimum like 3K, and that's it. It's because like you have overhead costs, you have plenty of other things that come in. You got to pay your payroll. When I say CAC, I'm mainly referring to like the ad spend in this case, ad spend and salespeople, not necessarily like the HubSpot subscription or something along those lines. But we need that kind of wiggle room in there because like otherwise you're just going to be bleeding money. So I look at CAC to LTV, CPA or cost per acquisition. So how much does it cost to acquire new customers? That's kind of redundant there. ROAS, so what's our return on ad spend? For me on the marketing side, that's huge. I like to shoot for a 4x ROAS. So for every $1 I spend, I want to make sure it's generating $4. I like that within I'd say 30-day time frame, or more like 21-day time frame, but minimum like 30-day time frame. So we're able to recoup those funds early. And then of course payroll. So that's kind of factored into burn rate, I guess. But like, how much are we going to have in payroll? I was involved in a company earlier this year where our built-in payroll was about 30K and our ad spend was about 60K. And that extra 30K makes a huge difference, to be honest, because we're coming in at zero and we have $90,000 a month in expenses. So we need to make sure, like, month one, in order to not lose money, we had to make 90 grand month one, which, that's a lot of pressure, to be completely frank. And especially like if there's an expectation of being profitable in month one, that extra 30 or so makes a huge difference. So how much are we paying people? What is the structure of those deals? All that good stuff. I'd like to have all these financials out of the way, have a pretty firm idea on each of these. Some of these, like, you're not going to be able to predict right off the bat. Like if I'm looking at this list here, I have a reasonable idea of what CPA is, what ROAS will be, what our LTV is going to be, but I don't know that for a fact. Versus payroll, I can figure out what payroll is going to be prior to launching the company in most cases, because that's just more so basic planning. Like, what roles do you need to hire, and what are we going to pay these people? You should know that before you do it. Versus like ROAS, when you launch a funnel, it's kind of impossible to predict. But so what else? Next, so this one is I guess not controversial. I'd say I call it sex appeal. Like, how sexy is what you're selling? If I look at a company and I see like, oh, this is just fucking awesome. This is the coolest thing I've ever seen. This is such a game changer. Versus I look at something and I'm just like, oh, that's kind of boring. It's like I'm not particularly interested in that. I don't get excited about this. You want things that stand out, especially when I think of this from a marketing standpoint. Like, if something's not going to stand out on ads, then that makes my life a lot harder. It makes it harder to sell something if it's not going to stand out on ads. Like, for example, we had a Section 8 real estate company earlier this year. So if you look at Section 8 real estate, it's like, all right, I can spend 20K and I'm going to make like $500 to $700 a month, like potentially for eternity. It's like I front the down payment, it's 20K. Cash on cash return is like somewhere between 20 to 35%. So I'll probably make back like 6K year one, and by year three or four, I'll make back my initial down payment, and I'm just making like $500 to $700 a month on autopilot for the rest of the year, or I mean for the rest of, like, I don't know, until the property gets destroyed or something, and someone's managing it. I don't have to deal with the tenants, and the government backs it, so like even if things totally break down, I still get paid. That to me is sex appeal. That I hear that. Like, when I was writing the ads for this, I'm just thinking like, wow, that's incredible. Like, I want that. If it has that sex appeal to it, it makes it way easier to sell, which is a company I want to work with. Now, kind of on the flip side of this, there is another thing to consider. That is it evergreen? Is this something that I see that's actually going to work out long term? Or is this something that's just sort of like, it's for now? It's going to make money for now. It's going to do all right in the next 18 to 24 months, but long term, it's probably not going to be a thing. That's a big part of the appeal of real estate, for example. Like, if you own a property and it's decent, it's in a good location, it's pretty evergreen in that case. It's probably not going away. So I like having businesses that are evergreen. Next is scalability. So is this a company I can scale to the moon, or is it something that's going to cap out at a certain rate? Like, I look at marketing agencies, for example. It's really hard to scale a marketing agency past, I would say, like $10 million a year. I have a lot of friends who run marketing agencies. It's not an easy game at scale. It's a great place to start. It's a great like starter business, your first company you've ever had. But I'd probably get out of it after then. I would say it's actually, I know a lot of good operators who get capped at like $3 to $5 million a year, and they're not that profitable. The margins on it aren't the greatest. So from a scalability standpoint, it's not like a software company. How many billion-dollar unicorn software companies are out there? Like lots of them. I don't know many billion-dollar marketing agencies. I know plenty of billion-dollar software companies. So is the company something that can actually scale? That is very big to me. Next is recurring revenue. So a lot of businesses that I work with have kind of like a pay in full type of model. So they'll collect a lot of cash up front, but there isn't any real like recurring revenue to go with the business. That is like a hard business to run. It's very, very stressful in my opinion, because no matter how good your month is, when I start on November 1st in 3 weeks, I'm at zero. And if my burn rate's high, if I have a lot of payroll, if I'm going to spend several $100,000 on ads, that is, if you don't have that recurring revenue coming in, your back is up against the wall every single month, which it's draining over time. As an entrepreneur, as a founder, having that kind of setup month after month, year after year after year, it is very stressful, in my opinion. And that also leads me to, stress aside, that leads me to my next point is exit potential / enterprise value. No one wants to buy a company that doesn't have recurring revenue. Like I can't think of a single company off the top of my head that's exited that had no recurring revenue, unless it was some like weird situation where they're only buying the tech and it didn't have any revenue at all. But like you need to have true enterprise value behind your company so that a potential buyer can come in and take it off your hands and ideally cut you a very, very large check. So if you don't have those, pieces in place, if you don't have real enterprise value behind the company, I'm not personally interested in starting anything at this point in my life. I'm 31 years old. I've been doing this for a while now. Like I wouldn't really start just like a basic cash flow business. I'd want something that I can actually sell someday. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. What's the EBITDA of the company? How much moat do you have? Is there a leadership team in place? Do you have proprietary tech? How hard would it be for a buyer to come in and continue just operating it without missing a beat? Do you have key man dependency? How is the trajectory of your industry looking? There's I'm not like an M&A expert, but there's a million different things that go into like enterprise value of a company. But that is just kind of at a nutshell, like a big one for me. Is it something that can be sold? Because I can tell you for a fact, it really, really sucks when you run a company for like a few years at a time and then you realize it's trending downwards and it's never going to sell. And sure, you made some good money in it, but like it's not something that's ever going to be exited. I've been there a couple different times and it really kind of sucks. So having something with real enterprise value, that's huge to me. So these are just 9 things that come to me off the top of my head. Now, there's definitely more to this, but if you do all 9 of these, like if business checks all those boxes, and again, you're probably not going to check all of them, but if you can just get like a couple of these, like if you just solve the right problem and you time it right and you have a good set of co-founders, you'll be good. It's kind of hard to not succeed if you nail those 3. If the financials aren't perfect, hopefully you and your co-founders have a good amount of cash in the bank and can float it for a while. Or if you've got to go raise funding, that's a different conversation. But if you can just get a couple of these right, then you should have a pretty good business on your hands. So that's it for today. Hopefully this is helpful. Feel free to drop me a subscribe and I'll be dropping more videos like this in the future. So thanks a lot for watching.